I live, I die, I live again!
Hello, my name is Kathy and welcome back to my series on Celtic influences in pop culture. I'm continuing to look at Mad Max Fury Road. If you haven't seen my first video, which is about Celtic chariot warfare and the combat tactics in Mad Max Fury Road, then you can check that out. In this video, I'm going to be looking at Celtic mythology and religion and how this is present in Mad Max. If you want to see more videos of me talking about the Celts in modern pop culture, but also just my love of books and my love of the Iron Age, then hit subscribe to keep up to date with my videos. The first thing to acknowledge is that Mad Max has a very interesting internal religious system and mythological system. You can see this particularly in the conversation that Nux has with Capable.
3 times the gates were opened to me.
What gates?
I was awaited in Valhalla. They were calling my name. I should be walking with the immortal, no feasting with the heroes of all time.
I'd say it was your manifest destiny not to.
So clearly we can see from this that there is a strong influence from Norse mythology and religion. And on the surface it may seem as though Celtic and Norse things are really quite similar. There are some surface similarities, but actually their understandings of the world are completely different. I don't know enough about Norse mythology to really go into a detailed comparison, but it's certainly something that I could do later down the line if I had the space to research it. So you can see him talking about riding into Valhalla, about there being a warrior's feast. However, there is one particular line, something that people continue to go back to when they look at Mad Max, that really hints that there's something else going on. Here it is again.
I live, I die, I live again!
So what's so interesting about this clip? In our understanding of death, it might seem like what he's saying is that he will live, he will physically die, and then he will live again in the afterlife, in Valhalla. However, this somewhat discards what ancient people felt about death. You see, for most ancient people, death was definitely something that was going to happen. I mean, obviously that's still the case now, but it's less acknowledged by us. We're seen as such a complete and utter individual, such an autonomous unit, that to think of ourselves as passing into a realm of death means that we simply don't exist anymore. Whereas the dead were very much present in a lot of ancient people's lives. They honoured their ancestors, and we particularly see it with the Celts. It was absolutely imperative that you honoured your ancestors, and they played just as important a role in death as they did in life. There's some very interesting burial customs that we come across when we look at the Celts. One of these is particularly prevalent in Wessex, and that is the fact that we have what were pits. Now originally they were used as grain storage, but they later were sort of filled in with other things. So we've got things like fragments of pottery, we've got some animal bones, but we've also got some human bones, and this is really key. They aren't full human bodies, and actually when they analysed them, they found that they'd been somewhat polished, they had been handled, and it seems to be that what they would do would be to bury the person, and eventually when they needed to bury someone else, they would open up the grave and they would take out parts of the person. So they would usually take the skull, or they would take long bones. So they would take things like bones in the leg, perhaps bones in the arm, and they would put these into the community. And this meant that they could continue to be part of the village life. They could still be accessed as an ancestral figure, and they provided some protection and some legitimacy to the people who still lived in these communities. So we can see that this idea that I live, I die, I live again is a huge idea, because there's one other thing that the Celts believed in, or that they seem to have believed in, and that is the transmigration of souls. So the transmigration of souls is perhaps best known as reincarnation, the idea that your soul will go into another body after death. Now, it's very difficult to say exactly what they believed because the Druids did not write things down. The best sources we have are Greek and Roman. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus said that the Druids believed that, quote, the souls of men are immortal and that after a definite number of years they live a second life when the soul passes to another body. And Julius Caesar wrote of the Celts, they wish to inculcate this as one of their leading tenets, that souls do not become extinct but pass after death from one body to another. And they think that men by this tenet are in great degree stimulated to valour, the fear of death being disregarded. Now it's difficult to say what exactly the Celts believed, because the Druids didn't write anything down, and it's very reasonable to assume that their beliefs were not being accurately recorded. So we have to take all of this with a pinch of salt. But still there's this idea that for the Celts, you would live, you would go into death, you would exist for some time in death, and then your soul would come back. You would be born again into a new body. I will look at this again in way more detail. There are more areas of pop culture, other areas that look at this further or represent it in a different way, so I'll look at it then. But for now, let's just say that the Celts believed that they really did live again. And in other ancient practices, when you were dead, you were dead. You weren't living in death, you were part of death. And you did continue to have an existence somewhat in that, but it wasn't the same as being alive. They were two very different states. So we can see elements of what the Celts believed about death and how they viewed it in terms of battle and why Nux does what he does. Julius Caesar also says that they had this belief and this meant that they could be fearless in battle because they didn't have to worry about dying so much. They knew that they would come back, that they would be back in the world. Okay, it would take a while, but they would be back again. And of course, we see a lot of sacrifice and a lot of bloodlust in Mad Max Fury Road. As I said in my previous video, the act of encouragement from their family and their community that they would bring with them to watch the battle would mean that they were particularly charged up and ready to sacrifice if it meant victory and bringing lots of honour, so that they could be an especially honoured ancestor. In my previous video, you'll remember that I talk about the Celtic practice of taking heads, which is also seen in Mad Max. Now I'm going to show some clips of as many skulls as I can find. Even the Citadel, the absolute head of their world, is represented by a skull. So why were heads important to the Celts? The importance of the head is that it is the seat of the soul. So within it resides that person's power, who that person is, their ancestral line in some respects. So heads were a way of showcasing power. They were a way of saying how many you had killed. They were also a way of honouring your ancestors, to keep not their severed heads necessarily embalmed as they would do with their enemies, but to keep their skulls and to bury them within the community to ensure protection. Now the issue in Mad Max is that they're not just using heads, they're particularly using skulls, although heads as important are also referenced.
For a while, even Larry and Barry stopped chewing on my windpipe.
Who are Larry and Barry?
My mates. Larry and Barry.
But the significant difference between the Celtic importance of the head and the importance of the skull is that it's a skull. You can even see that the body art of the War Boys reflects skulls.
And I salute thy half-life war boys, who will ride with me eternal on the highways of Valhalla.
So this points to the fact that this is a brutal society. It is a death cult. There is nothing so honoured as to be one of the glorious dead, and by all regards, life is pretty horrible. That's the whole point. They have consumed the world quite literally. There is a huge shortage and scarcity of resources, and they hoard these. This is then put into balance by the many mothers. The use of skulls and the imagery of skulls points to a Celtic mythology, but with all of the hope taken from it. The Celts had to have a pretty positive view on death because their lives were often short and were often quite miserable. As much as I love the Celts, I'm under no illusions that their lives were very, very difficult. We also have to remember that for the majority of the time, the Celts were not warriors, they were farmers. So if we look at it from that angle, areas of war were very much worth perhaps sacrificing yourself in, because it meant you would come back, and you'd come back in a time of peace. So those are the elements of Celtic mythology and religion that can be seen in Mad Max Fury Road. Now this is a reminder that obviously a lot of the internal religion and mythology in Mad Max is Norse, and there are similarities between Norse and Celtic, but they are different. And I think that there are certainly some moments which, in my view, point to a more Celtic worldview. But again, as I said in my last video, this is very much me looking at a piece of pop culture through the lens of Celtic understanding. This is not saying that the writers had any intention to reflect this, I'm just finding it there. And as I said before, I think this is to do with the fact that Celtic stories are so old and they're so ingrained into our culture that they naturally form. My video next week will be the concluding parts of my examining of Mad Max, and I'll be looking at Furiosa as a new Boudica. I will give more information on who Boudica was. She was the famous warrior queen who fought back against the Romans, although, as I will mention, there were other people who fought the Romans. I do incorporate a lot of my MA research into these videos, so it's not just me waffling on about how much I love the Celts. I do try and bring in as much historical fact as possible, because people don't have as much awareness of the Celts and their society as they do of things such as Roman or Greek society. And I have nothing against Greek and Roman societies, they're very interesting, but the Celts are something completely different. So if you like this video, please give it a like. If you want to see more of me talking about the Celts, talking about more of my research, or more things about books, then please subscribe. Because I don't have quite enough to do, I'm also in the middle of writing a novel that's set in the Iron Age period. It does have a few fantasy elements, but I'm trying to keep it as historically accurate as possible. If you'd like to know more about that, I'll link my website down below where I tend to write about that more. But also happy to do some videos about writing and just about my reading progress and about studying and what it's like to be an MA student. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.